Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. Today's topic that we're going to be discussing is purchasing tenanted property. This is a question I get, or a topic I discuss a lot with our clients as we work with a lot of landlords that are either buying their first or second property. They look into what's the better thing to do, purchase something where it's vacant or purchase something with a tenant. And anyways, there's pros and cons to everything. So we're going to break it all down. We're going to discuss it with you today. I also, again, have joining me today Mr. Rob Di Lisi from Stonegate Legal Services, Paralegal who only deals with landlord and tenant issues. Rob, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. How are you?
Yeah, thank you for having me back. I'm excited to talk about this. This is a really popular subject.
Yeah, definitely, right? Especially right now as it is a buyer's market. Investors are out there right now looking to acquire properties. And they're buying properties maybe that are already having a tenant in it. And, the questions that I get asked a lot are, can we raise the rent right away? Is there a way to evict that tenant? Can we pick our own person? Is there a way we can pretend to move in? And all these kinds of things that people have asked me. So let's start with the first one that I mentioned. Is it possible when you buy a property with a tenant in it to raise the rent? Can you make any changes to their lease?
So what you need to consider is that any lease that is in existence continues automatically with the new buyer. The question is it on a year lease or is it on a month to month lease? So to answer the question, can you raise the rent? You can only raise the rent once per year. So if it is on a lease, you would have to wait till the end of the term and then give proper notice. However, if it's on month to month and the new buyer takes over, you can't just raise the rent just out of whatever you want. You still have to follow the process, which would be the N1 or the N2, minimum 90 days notice, and then you can only raise it in accordance to the guideline. Unless it's not rent controlled, then you can raise it to whatever you want. Another note that I will say is that, and we've talked this on previous presentations, is the term security of tenure. That means that the tenant is entitled to occupy the rental unit after the initial term specified in a rental agreement. So everything continues automatically. And there's a term in real estate that all real estate agents should know. It's called covenants with the land. So any agreements that you have, previous owner continues now to the next owner.
So let's say then Rob, a person buys a property with a tenant in it. They can't change the rent, right? Which you just said, other than what the guideline was, which this year was 2.5%, and they can only do it once a year, so they can't do that right away. Can they get them out? Can they evict them? Can they choose a new tenant to move in? Can they do anything?
So no. So if a buyer takes over, they're entitled to follow through with the existing lease. So there's only three ways to terminate a tenancy. Number one is if the tenant decides to leave, and that it would be giving an N9. The next would be if the landlord and the tenant agree to a termination, which would be the N11, or if there's a court order through the landlord and tenant board. So if you want to end the tenancy, you can't do that out of your will. The only way would be to do is going to be through a mutual agreement, which goes back to the term cash for keys.
So through the years as a realtor, again, we've helped people buy tenanted properties, and we've helped people buy them as an investor or as personal use. And as personal use, you can then get the tenant to vacate the property with your moving in with a minimum 60 days notice. I'll let you give all the legal terms about how that works too, but that's the general basics of it. And then then I have investors that know this information, and they ask me, can I do that? Can we say we're moving in? And obviously they can't do that, but I'll leave that with you. How would you involve somebody with that?
So here's the thing is that if someone says that they want to claim to move in, you need to understand there are stipulations that they have to be aware of. So what they're talking about is something called an N12, and that would be for personal use. A note that I want to say is that this can be only if an individual wants to move in. It cannot be for a corporation. So let's go through what the stipulations are. It is a minimum 60 days notice. It comes with a 1 month rent compensation. And that person, which has to be arm's length, which is immediate family, has to move in for 1 year. However, this is a point to really remember. On the N12, the second page, fourth paragraph, it tells the tenant, you do not have to move out. You are entitled to wait for a hearing. To get to a hearing for an N12, you are looking at minimum 6 to 8 months. But there's more. Once you get to the hearing, if you're successful, you're going to wait 30, 60 days to get the order. And then that person must move in for 1 year. So if you look at the timeline, you're almost looking at 2 years before you could re-rent or sell the property. Even though the notice is a minimum 60 days notice, remember, this is Canada, this is Ontario, they have the right to wait for a hearing.
It's interesting. When we bought a tenanted property for personal use, we definitely advised them that, be prepared that the tenant doesn't move out on your closing date, right? At this time, these clients were living at home with their parents. They were buying their first house. So it wasn't a big issue for them if they couldn't move in on that closing date. Same thing kind of happens with an investor, right? If they can't take over that property on the closing date, when they're looking to do something, there can be a way to renegotiate a better price for that due to the inconvenience. Where it does become a problem, again, is the personal use one, where they have a property to sell as well and need to move in there, and then the domino effect comes into place. So if you are buying a tenanted property, what would you suggest are some clauses that we should make sure that are in our agreement of purchase and sale to best protect us as a buyer?
So I can't recommend clauses, but what I need a buyer to realize is that you need to determine before you buy the property, are you agreeing to take on the tenant or are you looking for vacant possession? And the reason why I say that is because clause number 2 in the agreement of purchase and sale already says that the seller shall guarantee vacant possession. So if the tenant, let's say the buyer's willing to assume the tenant, there could be a further negotiation in regards to the price. The only thing that you may want to have in there is that if an N12 is going to be given for personal use, that you can start the process with the seller, because remember that minimum 60 days notice, the 1 month's compensation should be done through the seller. And then after closing, it continues with the buyer. The only thing is that if you're going to do that, remember that N12 must be flawless. You cannot have any mistakes, because by the time you file the paperwork and you get to the board, if there are any mistakes, it will be dismissed.
So again, from an investor point of view here, when we're buying these properties, there's multifamily and stuff like that where it is harder to always get a completely vacant property, right? Buying a single family home, you can wait and buy something that can turn into an investment property that doesn't already have a tenant. They're easier to find than something multifamily. With multifamily, most times you are taking on somebody else's tenants. So the due diligence is very important to make sure that you're looking into these tenants, the leases, the agreements that are in place already, because you, the new landlord, have to agree to everything that is already in place, which is what we've discussed here. So that's the most important thing, I think, for you guys to understand is when you're taking on a new tenant or taking on a new property with existing tenants, everything that they're doing right now stays the same, and you have to accommodate to that and understand that. Right? Would you add anything on to that there, Rob?
Yeah, I'm going to say there's one last thing that before we finish up here. So there's 3 things that you should, like a buyer should consider. Number 1, is there an existing lease agreement? If there is, you want to see that. You want to see if it's on month to month, confirmation of the existing terms. You want to know if there's any existing deficiencies or orders against the landlord. Number 2 is a tenant acknowledgement. You need them. If there's no lease in place, you need to get a tenant acknowledgement so you know who the tenants are. Because if you ever want to do a notice, you need to know who those people are. And the last thing is that the seller should sign a direction to the tenant that states that the buyer will be the new landlord after closing. Those are 3 things that are very important when you are a buyer buying a tenanted property.
You're excellent, Rob. I love listening to you talk. You cover everything so well, and you're very informative with what we discuss. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Again, this is all about buying property with tenants in place, or buying a tenanted property, I should say. But yes, thanks so much for joining us. Until next time, thanks, Rob. Bye for now. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're finding it informative and useful, make sure to like, subscribe, share with a friend so that we can keep getting the information out there to Ontario landlords. And keep on joining us. We'll see you next time.